The first siren was a phone vibrating on the glass table, then 50 more, and Victor Hale said, "Why is the stock halted?" Monitors bloomed red as push alerts stacked like falling tiles. Mara Quinn said, "A leak, maybe multiple, it hit every outlet at once." The air tasted metallic, like the moment before lightning. Victor stared at the headline accusing him of falsified growth, and he said, "That is a lie." The board chat pinged with clipped fury and careful emojis. Daniel Price said, "I am on with investor relations, hold the line." A live feed in the corner switched to a panel of smirking experts and soft knives. Outside the glass, employees slowed, then stared, then vanished into whispers. Victor felt cameras without seeing them, the way heat moves under a door. Mara said, "We need a statement in 7 minutes or we lose the hour." Victor said, "Tell legal I want facts, not prayers." The building hummed like a hive gone violent. A server alert pulsed amber, and even the coffee machine seemed to hiss. The war room smelled of marker ink and fear, and Victor Hale said, "Lock the door." The legal team filed in with notebooks like shields. Mara Quinn said, "Allegations cite doctored user metrics over 8 quarters." Victor paced the length of the table, careful, coiled. Daniel Price said, "We deny in full and threaten countersuit." The screen showed timelines that did not belong to them. Victor said, "Find the source before noon." A junior analyst blinked hard at a spreadsheet that looked wounded. Mara said, "We assume multiple leaks, not one." Victor stopped at the glass and counted lightning forks over the river. He said, "Bring me the audit trails raw." The HVAC coughed, and the room swallowed the sound. Someone muted the TV and let the silence burn. A board call clicked alive, and every square felt like a verdict. Graham Kincaid said, "You have 1 hour to stabilize optics." Victor Hale said, "We stabilize truth, then optics." Someone coughed as if money were caught in their throat. Mara Quinn said, "Outside counsel is drafting a measured denial." Graham smiled without teeth. Victor said, "Stop smiling." Daniel Price said, "Investors want a timestamp on our internal review." A red banner crawled across a financial network with fresh claims. Victor said, "Mute the television." The storm rattled the vents like coins in a jar. Graham said, "If you fall, I will catch the company." Victor did not blink. The first reporter breached the lobby like a spear. Security radios crackled warnings, and Victor Hale said, "Bring them to the second atrium, not here." Mara Quinn said, "We hold with a placeholder line, no ad-lib." Daniel Price said, "A pre-market halt extends the panic." Victor said, "Panic is already in the bloodstream." He practiced a sentence that tasted like metal. The PR director said, "We need warmth, not rage." Victor said, "We need accuracy." The lobby cameras rotated, restless eyes on rails. The elevator doors opened like a dare, and the storm wheeled a fresh gust inside. The intercom chimed again, softer, and Rosa Bell said, "I found an anomaly in access logs." Victor Hale said, "Show me." She traced a ghost account that moved like water. Mara Quinn said, "That pattern repeats before every leak event." Daniel Price said, "Could be a vendor." Victor said, "Or a hand inside the wall." The data points lined up like a quiet confession. Rosa said, "This trail leads toward finance." The room held its breath as thunder landed over the river. Victor said, "Shut every back door now." Somewhere a server fan screamed, then fell into a steady spin. The rain pressed its face to the glass as the headlines cooled from fire to ash, and Victor Hale said, "This is the bill for every shortcut we never took." He dialed Carter Wynn and heard a slow breath like gravel. Carter Wynn said, "You climbed a clean ladder, but the wall might be rotten." Victor said, "The numbers are real. The accusation is theater." Carter Wynn said, "Theater moves markets faster than truth." The city smeared into ribbons as a siren traced the avenue. Mara Quinn slipped a note under his palm and said, "Staff needs your voice, not your shield." Victor said, "If I speak now, I set the frame for the trial." Carter Wynne said, "Lead with the wound you can survive." Victor felt the room lean as if the building had thoughts. He said, "I built this to outlast me, and now it demands blood." Carter Wynne said, "Pay in courage before they price it in fear." Victor ended the call and let the dial tone measure his resolve. The stairwell hummed like a throat before a shout, and Mara Quinn said, "You keep staring at the skyline like it owes you mercy." Victor Hale said, "It owes the truth, and I owe the people who gave me their mornings." Mara said, "Then stop speaking to the market and speak to them." A footstep echoed above, a single watcher failing to be absent. Victor said, "If I confess to uncertainty, they will feed on it." Mara said, "If you fake certainty, they will smell the varnish." He touched the steel rail and felt the cold go bone deep. She said, "Tell them the plan and the fear in the same breath." He said, "Fear is not a currency I like to circulate." She said, "Then call it risk and show your math." He nodded once, as if untangling a knot behind his ribs. The stairwell swallowed their words and gave them back as resolve. The analytics bay purred like a patient animal, and Rosa Bell said, "The ghost account pivots around finance endpoints." Victor Hale said, "Show me where it breathes." Lines of traffic pulsed on the screen like city veins. Rosa said, "It spoofs device IDs and borrows stale credentials." Victor said, "Someone kept a key when the lock was changed." Daniel Price hovered at the doorway and said, "We should not accuse a department on a hunch." Victor said, "We accuse no one, we narrow paths." Rosa said, "I can sandbox the pattern and trip it with decoys." Victor said, "Do it, and log every footstep it takes." The monitors flickered, as if the storm had opinions. Daniel said, "Investors want a phrase they can repeat without choking." Victor said, "Give them this phrase. We are tracing the breach to its smallest lie." The executive corridor shone like a blade, and Graham Kincaid said, "Your hour is nearly up." Victor Hale said, "Time keeps moving even when courage stalls." Graham said, "Share price bleeds while you polish sentences." Daniel Price said, "We drafted a line for pre-market reassurance." Graham said, "Try a line that bends the knee to reality." Victor took a breath and felt the storm settle in his lungs. He said, "Reality is we were attacked, and we will show the path of the knife." Graham said, "Be careful naming knives in rooms with sharp ears." Mara Quinn joined them and said, "The staff address tapes in 10. Graham smiled the way Frost smiles at a window. Victor said, "Stay for the message or step aside." Graham said, "I stay for the company, not for you." The corridor lights hummed, indifferent and bright. The camera red dot felt like a pulse, and Victor Hale said, "Good morning, and thank you for the work you did before dawn." The room held stillness like a rehearsal for trust. He said, "A claim hit the wires that our growth was built on smoke." He let the silence measure the insult. He said, "Our records will speak, and you will see them speak." Mara Quinn stood just beyond frame and said, "Keep going." He said, "We found a breach pattern and are tracing it with care." Daniel Price said, "Close with timing." Victor said, "By end of day, you will have the first audit packet, unredacted." He said, "I ask for steadiness while we do the hard, slow work." The red dot blinked, then steadied, as if it believed him. He said, "Hold your ground, and I will hold mine." The market bell rang like a gunshot across the screens, and Victor Hale said, "We are bleeding in public." Daniel Price said, "Pre-market rumors drove this drop, not fundamentals." Mara Quinn said, "Staff are whispering names of traitors already." Victor said, "Let them whisper, but keep them working." The storm eased outside, but the pressure in the room climbed higher. Graham Kincaid joined the call with a voice like a blade and said, "Investors will abandon you unless you cut away dead weight." Victor said, "They invested in my vision, not your threats." Graham laughed softly, and even the silence afterward sounded cruel. Mara whispered, "They want to see you crack, but don't give them the scene. Victor stared at the live ticker plunging like a stone and said, I will not feed them my fear. In the hushed staff auditorium, Victor Hale faced hundreds of wary eyes and said, We are accused, but we are not guilty. Rosa Bell sat in the front row, notebook trembling in her hands. Mara Quinn said, Remind them their work is still the backbone. Victor said, Every hour you've given is proof we stand taller than lies. The staff stirred, but suspicion remained. One voice from the crowd asked, Why should we believe when investors don't? Victor said, Because investors buy numbers, but you build them. Daniel Price muttered, Keep it steady, keep it calm. Victor's pulse felt like thunder in his wrists, but his voice stayed unbroken as he said, We fight not for rumors but for truth you created. The break room had turned into a hive of rumor, and Rosa Bell said, They think finance is poison. Victor Hale entered, silence falling like glass. He said, Say the rumors here, not behind screens. A junior engineer stammered, The ghost account, it points to finance. Victor said, A pattern is not proof. Mara Quinn said, Silence breeds conspiracy, and conspiracy breeds collapse. Daniel Price said, Then shut down chatter with a memo, not sermons. Victor said, No, truth first, memos later. The vending machine buzzed as if to fill the pause. Rosa said, If it is finance, then no one's safe. Victor said, Then we dig until no ghost remains. The staff shifted, uneasy but attentive. In the glass boardroom, Daniel Price whispered, We should consider a controlled sacrifice. Victor Hale said, You mean fire someone for smoke we did not light? Daniel said, It calms the markets. Mara Quinn said, It destroys morale. Victor said, Sacrifices are for priests, not leaders. Graham Kincaid's face on screen smirked, A scapegoat saves the herd. Victor said, I will not sell flesh to buy time. The storm outside broke into a rare beam of light across the table. Mara said, Then we need evidence faster than they need blood. Victor's silence was heavier than any denial. Daniel whispered, Then you better pray evidence comes before noon. In the server vault, Rosa Bell said, The breach trail is alive, it just moved. Victor Hale leaned close to the screen, eyes narrowing. Rosa said, It pinged off finance then rerouted through legal. Mara Quinn said, That means an insider is feeding it. Daniel Price said, Or multiple insiders. Victor said, Ghosts do not walk alone unless someone opens the door. Rosa typed furiously, code streaming like falling rain. She said, I can corner it, but it will know it's trapped. Victor said, Then corner it and let it show its teeth. The hum of servers deepened, thunder rolling in the wires. Mara whispered, We are close enough to bleed. Victor said, Then we bleed, if it gives us truth. The storm had softened, but the building still carried the hum of nerves when Rosa Bell said, The ghost account isn't just a breach, it's a hand steering us into fire. Victor Hale froze mid-stride. Mara Quinn said, Show it clearly. Rosa's trembling cursor highlighted a log, the pattern unmistakable. Daniel Price said, Finance won't survive this if we call it out. Victor said, Then maybe finance is the heart of the infection. The silence afterward felt surgical, sharp and unbearable. Graham Kincaid's voice cut through on call. One of your own is burning you alive. Victor said, If that's true, then betrayal sits at this table. Rosa's face paled as she whispered, The anomaly maps back to Daniel's credentials. The boardroom glass quivered with tension as Daniel Price said, Those logs are forged, you know I would never. Victor Hale's eyes did not flinch. Mara Quinn said, Forgery or not, the breach carries your shadow. Daniel's fists balled tight, his voice cracking. I fought for this company harder than anyone here. Rosa Bell said softly, But the system does not lie. Graham Kincaid said, Every empire dies from within. Victor said, I need truth, not poetry. Daniel slammed his palm flat. You want my head to save yours. The room echoed with that accusation, every syllable like stone on glass. The lights dimmed with a surge, as if the building itself leaned in. Rosa Bell said, "I traced the packet backward. It's no forgery." Daniel Price shouted, "Check it again!" Victor Hale's voice stayed even. "Daniel, either you explain or you resign now." Mara Quinn whispered, "Victor, if you push too far, the board will use this as the blade." Daniel's face cracked with fury. "I stood beside you when no one else did. And this is how you repay me?" Victor said, "You stood beside me, but maybe you also opened the door behind me." Silence fell heavy, broken only by the thrum of servers. The staff corridors buzzed with whispers that ran faster than truth. Rosa Bell said, "They're already saying Daniel betrayed us." Victor Hale said, "Then we need proof, not gossip." Mara Quinn said, "Proof buys time, gossip burns it." Daniel Price stormed past them, shoulders like knives, muttering, "You'll regret this circus." Victor said, "Maybe, but we will regret silence more." The walls seemed to hum with every rumor, each step down the corridor feeling like a march toward collapse. Rosa whispered, "He'll strike back harder than anyone." Victor said, "Let him. At least now I know where the blade points." Alone in the office, Victor Hale stood before the skyline, rain tapering into light. Graham Kincaid's voice lingered on the speaker. "You trusted him, and he gutted you." Victor said, "He gutted himself when he chose power over loyalty." Mara Quinn stepped in. "The board will move on this by dusk." Victor said, "Then by dusk, we bring them something stronger than suspicion." Rosa Bell entered quietly, holding a folder, and said, "I pulled more traces. The hand guiding Daniel wasn't his alone." Victor turned slowly, eyes narrowing. He said, "Then who else wants me burned alive?" The boardroom was a battlefield disguised in glass when Graham Kincaid said, "The vote will decide whether you stay or fall." Victor Hale stood rigid, pulse steady, though his chest burned. Mara Quinn whispered, "Numbers are against us unless you break them with conviction." Daniel Price sat apart, arms crossed, face pale but defiant. Victor said, "If you believe a ghost in finance should topple the work of thousands, then vote against me." The board muttered, shuffling papers like daggers. Graham smirked, "Charm is cheap, but liability is expensive." Victor said, "Liability is trusting men who hide knives behind smiles." The storm outside returned as if to score the moment. Victor Hale raised his voice. "This company does not belong to whispers. It belongs to builders." Mara Quinn said, "Show them the trail Rosa uncovered." Rosa Bell entered, clutching fresh evidence. She said, "The ghost account mapped not only to Daniel's access, but also mirrored Graham's offshore servers." The room gasped like a single throat. Graham Kincaid snarled through the speaker, "You dare accuse me?" Victor said, "I don't accuse, I present proof." Daniel whispered, "So I was only the shield." Mara said, "And Graham was the sword." The room erupted into overlapping shouts as the storm outside cracked with thunder. The board chair raised his hand, voice trembling. "Enough. We decide now." Victor Hale said, "Decide. But understand this, if you side with corruption, you inherit its ruin." Daniel Price buried his face in his hands. Mara Quinn said, "Evidence is truth. Vote with it or against it." Graham Kincaid shouted, "You have no right to speak of truth when your empire is bleeding." Victor said, "Bleeding, yes, but not dead, not while I breathe." Rosa Bell whispered, "They're scared, but fear can still choose courage." The vote cards lifted like blades. Victor gripped the edge of the table, refusing to bow. The board chair declared, "By narrow margin, Victor Hale remains." The air cracked with gasps, relief, and outrage colliding. Victor said, "Then I fight with every bone left in me." Graham Kincaid roared, "This is not over." Mara Quinn said, "No, it's only begun." Rosa Bell handed Victor the folder, whispering, "We still have to trace deeper." Daniel Price stood slowly, eyes hollow, and said, "I was their pawn." Victor said, "Pawn or player, you chose silence." The rain eased, leaving streaks of light crawling down the glass. Mara, said Dell, strike back harder now. Victor said, then we will strike truer. Alone in the corridor after the vote, Victor Hale leaned against the glass, breath shallow. Mara Quinn said, you survived the knife, but the war isn't finished. Victor said, no, the war just entered daylight. Rosa Bell stepped closer, saying, if Graham controls servers offshore, he has allies we haven't seen. Daniel Price emerged from the shadows whispering, they used me, but I know where the next strike will come. Victor's voice hardened, then speak, Daniel. And maybe you find redemption. The corridor hummed with the last echo of thunder, and Victor's reflection looked older than he remembered. The sky outside cleared to a pale silver, but the building felt darker inside. Victor Hale said, the board saved me, but the knife is still in the room. Mara Quinn said, we can't rest. Graham will rally unseen hands. Rosa Bell placed a drive on the table and whispered, this holds the pathways to his offshore servers. Victor turned it in his palm like a weapon. Daniel Price leaned against the wall, voice low, I can guide you in, but the cost will be bloodier than you imagine. Victor said, then guide us, we fight shadows with fire. The HVAC rattled as if the walls disapproved. Mara said, if this leaks, we collapse again. Victor said, if we hide it, we die slower. In the dim analytics bay, Rosa Bell said, if we enter his servers, we risk exposing everything. Daniel Price said, he's already inside ours. This is survival. Mara Quinn said, Victor, decide. Victor Hale said, open the door. The screen bloomed with encrypted pathways, glowing like veins in ice. Rosa typed, breath uneven. Daniel guided, pointing here, these are Graham's shell companies. Victor said, then we cut the strings he pulls. The room thrummed as if the storm had been captured in the wires. Mara whispered, we're crossing into his kingdom. Victor said, then let him feel our footsteps. The trail led deeper, until Rosa Bell gasped. This account isn't Graham's alone, there's a second hand here. Mara Quinn asked, who? The log scrolled, and Rosa whispered, a shadow investor, hidden for years. Victor Hale clenched his fists, the real puppeteer. Daniel Price said, then Graham was only the front, a weapon, not the general. Victor said, name them. Rosa hesitated, fear in her voice. An investor masked through 5 shell layers, Edwin Crow. Victor's jaw hardened, the man who funded my first round. Silence pressed against them like a tomb. Mara said, he raised you to burn you. Victor Hale stood at the long window, voice shaking but iron. Edwin Crow gave me my first check. Now he holds the knife at my throat. Mara Quinn said, then he's been waiting for this collapse all along. Daniel Price said, he built Graham as his spear. Rosa Bell said, he built you as his shield. Victor said, then I break the shield before it breaks me. The silence afterward felt heavier than thunder. Mara said, do you expose him or strike him in secret? Victor said, expose him, and I fall. Strike him in secret, and I might survive. His reflection on the glass looked like a stranger. The small war room felt like a bunker as Victor Hale said, we hit Crow's empire before dusk. Mara Quinn said, if you fail, the company dies. Daniel Price said, if we win, you may still lose your soul. Rosa Bell whispered, but at least we'll know the truth. Victor said, truth costs, but lies bankrupt faster. The server logs flickered with names, accounts, betrayals layered like scars. Victor pointed, target his false fronts, choke his leverage. Mara said, it's a gamble. Victor said, everything worth surviving is. The clock struck 3, sounding louder than any storm. The clock ticked toward dusk as Victor Hale stood in the war room, voice heavy. He said, Edwin Crow hides behind shadows, but tonight we cut through. Mara Quinn said, if we fail, your crown becomes his weapon. Rosa Bell whispered, I traced his false fronts. 5 collapsed when I pressed. Daniel Price muttered, he will come for me first. I was his tool. Victor said, then speak now and bury his reach. The tension hummed like live wire, as every screen glowed with Crow's network unraveling. Outside, the last streaks of sun slid down the skyline, fading into steel dusk. The servers roared as Rosa Bell said, "Crow's empire is unraveling, hell nowhere inside." Mara Quinn said, "He's too arrogant to hide now." Daniel Price leaned close, whispering, "Hell strike live through broadcast or board." Victor Hale said, "Then we welcome his fury." The screens blinked, and suddenly Edwin Crow's face filled every monitor, calm as stone. Crow said, "Victor, I raised you, now I bury you." Victor clenched his jaw. "You built me to serve, not to rule, but I rule still." Mara whispered. He forced the confrontation. The storm that had lingered outside returned as if summoned. Edwin Crow's voice boomed. "This empire was always mine. You were only the mask." Victor Hale said, "Then this mask learned to breathe without you." Rosa Bell's fingers flew, whispering, "I can cut his feeds if I push harder." Crow sneered, "Try, and I'll torch your markets before dawn." Daniel Price said, "He isn't bluffing." Mara Quinn said, "Bluff or not, silence him." Victor said, "No. Let him speak, so the world hears his poison." Crow's calm cracked into rage. "You'll regret this insolence." Victor said, "I regret nothing but trusting you." The servers hissed like serpents waiting to strike. The storm peaked as Rosa Bell shouted, "I traced his root access. If I sever it, he loses control." Victor Hale said, "Do it." Edwin Crow roared, "If you cut me out, I'll drag you with me." Mara Quinn said, "Victor, if she pulls this, your empire bleeds too." Victor's voice cracked, but held firm. "Better to bleed free than fatten his chains." Daniel Price whispered, "Crow built his empire on your shadow, and now you'll break it." Rosa hit the final command, and the monitors erupted in static like 1,000 dying screams. Silence filled the building after the crash. Victor Hale stood by the window, voice hollow. "We cut him out, but the cost will come." Mara Quinn said, "The board will never forgive the fire we lit." Rosa Bell said softly, "But we are free of his shadow." Daniel Price whispered, "And I am free of his leash, though never my guilt." Victor stared at the skyline where the storm was breaking into fragile dawn. He said, "We survived, but survival is no victory." The room hung heavy, as if waiting for the next storm. His last words drifted like ash. "Empires don't fall, they bleed forever."